Ethics, I don't actually think an academic is the best person to talk about ethics. I think that, I was thinking about this. We'll probably come back to being on a boat in relation to the theme of the talk, but I also thought it was interesting we were near the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? So the Rockin' and Rollin', right, is kind of a complicated thing in our society because the word originated in churches, in African American churches, when people were rockin' and a rollin' and making it through a tough passage. And that's to say that rock and roll really begins with spirit and soul and really deep connections with each other. And academics aren't so good at that. We're very analytic, and we have a lot of status issues, and we often don't think about community. So anyways, I'm going to talk about a problem that I think is really difficult. I'm going to pitch you a really serious creative problem. But I wanted to start by just talking about community. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to have discussion. I'm going to try to leave some room for that because I really am not used to lecturing. But I just wanted to mention that literally the discussions that are going to be in this presentation, there's a link to my Tumblr site, so even though I'm going to loosely follow some of the stuff on there, if you want to read more and get links and stuff, you can go to the presentation on the Tumblr site. But literally, the content of what I'm working on is something that a whole lot of we's are working on. And actually, a lot of these we's are in this room, and I would really like to see Cleveland, which is doing many of the things related to this through the Office of Sustainability and all sorts of grassroots efforts. I'd like to see that these we's get expanded. So just to mention, this is concrete. This isn't just shout outs. This is literally the stuff in here we've been talking about in groups. So I'm just kind of go around the room and look at some of the people. So I see Walter and Tony and Patrice from the Moral Inquiries Heights conversation group that meets at MaxBacks twice a month. We're working on something called presentism. It's a fancy name, but it's a real thing. It's like racism, except for it's about bias against the future. And it's actually a really serious ethical problem. We're working on that right now. I see Christina and Elaine. Christina, of course, just curated this amazing send-up of natural history, the People's Museum of Natural History at Spaces, which is in many ways a commentary on this idea of the Anthropocene and on many of the things that are going on now. And Elaine and Christina and I work on some issues around the right to safety with the socially engaged artist Michael Rockowitz right now. And this is about the right to safety that future generations have. I also see people from the ethics table at Case Western Reserve. I see Peter here. I see Dalton. The ethics table is a thing we do at Case Western Reserve basically every other week. It's totally open to the community, and the community generates questions that we talk about. And then last but not least, and this is a lot, these are literally things that we've been talking about these issues in these groups. I see Sarah from the Living Forms group, who is also part of the ethics table. That's a inter-university group that meets at Case Western. It's got College of Worcester, it's got John Carroll, it's got Oberlin, it's got Kent, Akron, it's got a lot of different places. I may have left some places out. And we're working on the problem of the Anthropocene right now. So there's all these different, I see Arthur there too, who's part of that group. So could you, if I just mentioned you, could you raise your hands? Because maybe somebody could strike up a conversation with you. If I just mentioned one of these groups, could you raise your hands? So there you go. If you see these people and you're interested in the topics, then these people also have contributed to this. Oh my gosh, there's Terry. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, okay, I'm gonna talk about some stuff that's pretty abstract, but I want to give you a concrete send away, which is that we'll talk about the word Anthropocene. How many of you have heard the word Anthropocene before? Okay, good. It's starting to become trendy, which is maybe not a good thing. But there's already a significant number of the people. But I'll talk about it just so we have a rough idea of it. But I'm going to argue that we should, although we should obviously be aware of this word in ways that we're not even aware yet, that actually we should think of ourselves as in the age of anthroponomy. The word, I know it's an awful word in the mouth, but it's a precise word, and precision can be good. The word we should have on our minds as a planet now. I really mean this, logically. This isn't just, oh, let me come up with a word that can brand the planet. The word is anthroponomy, which means the collective self-regulation of humankind as a whole. How vast is that? I'll talk about why that has to be the moral goal of people now. Yeah, so I'll talk about that. Okay, so the takeaway, the concrete takeaway, is I would like to see Cleveland become one point in a node of cities that are working concretely to produce anthroponomy. That would be an amazing thing for a Rust Belt city to do. And although many cities are working on sustainability, nobody is clearly yet realizing that the goal is anthroponomy. So that's the takeaway point. The other thing I'm going to say later in the talk is I'm going to talk about personal practices that help you keep the magic in the mess. They include music for me as well, but I'll actually give an allusion to a really ancient philosophical tradition that's probably closest to things that we do now in the meditative arts. Because one of the things I've found through working on the environment for so long is that people are regularly completely overwhelmed by the problem. And also just completely subdivided, like the character in your song, with all the different kinds of things we have to do during the day. And it's extremely hard to keep our eyes on the goal. And so it's very important to have practices of care for oneself to be able to do that. Okay, so let me just take you through a couple things quickly. Okay, let me get out of the way so you can see this. Okay, so the term Anthropocene is a geological term. I don't know, where should I stand? Maybe over here? Yeah, is this good? I'll try to walk back and forth. So it's a geological term, obviously, right? We've come out of the Pleistocene. The nearer period is the Holocene. It's the period that's followed on the last ice age. It's the period that gave us such an unbelievably hospitable planet. And the period we're unfortunately going out of, the Holocene, part of the Pleistocene, is really, it's like a fluke geologically. It's been very mild. The planet has been very stable. And as a result, we've been able to have agriculture. We've been able to more or less understand the patterns that we could farm in, the patterns that we could build in, the ways that we could expand our settlements. We're really lucky, and we tend not to be aware of that. But because of basically humanity's unbelievable power when it comes to our ability to use technology and to organize ourselves in increasingly complicated and powerful ways in our economies, we have been producing, actually this is kind of crazy, but for about 11,000 years, and then at about, you could start marking it at various periods. I'll go through the period. We've been producing a planetary force out of human history. And so you'll see there's a famous historian at the University of Chicago, Dipesh Chakrabarty, who wrote about this in the early 2000s. And he said, look, now is a time when you can no longer separate geological history or natural history from human history. Humans have become a force. So just to help you visualize this, and I'll just talk a little bit about the Anthropocene and then I'll move forward. Look, I mean, probably the thing that's on most of our minds is climate change, right? We're well aware of climate change now. So climate change is probably the most obvious signal that humanity has changed the entire biochemistry of the planet, okay? But related to climate change, as many of you know, is ocean acidification, and then all sorts of complicated dynamics that probably most recently have been maybe scaring the crap out of us around the risk of a mass extinction. The increased elevation rates of extinction are a result also of habitat destruction, of plastics in the soil, of rises in toxicity, of irradiation throughout the planet. All of these things are, I mean, I could just go on and on and on, of nitrogen runoff, right? All of these things are human caused. But the thing that's important to keep in mind is that kind of with increasing intensity and frequency, of course, the Industrial Revolution being kind of the main point, the 20th century being incredibly powerful with the petrochemical industry, with the nuclear industry, and including the industry of nuclear weapons, you get this kind of force of humanity which is starting to shift the kind of interbundled coils that make up the relatively stable order of our planet. And what's kind of crazy is we're starting to see it in our lifetime, which really shouldn't happen in a geological sense, but we are actually seeing the effects of climate change. We're seeing many of the issues that ourselves and our ancestors have caused. So the Anthropocene was coined by the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, who actually helped us solve the ozone problem. He won a Nobel Prize. In 2002, he said, look, folks, let's just pony up, right? Right now, you got to just realize that we're in for this. The planet now is the age of the human. We should call it the Anthropocene. Okay, so is that clear? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm clear. Okay, so now from the ethical standpoint, you might say, what's the big deal ethically? Okay, at some level you know it's a big deal, but what does this mean? So the only other thing I'm going to say, just to allude to causal predictions and allude to what we're worried about with our scientific predictions, is that, what we do know is that these various different interlocked changes to what are called the planetary boundaries, the 9 planetary boundaries, are kind of the pressing across the 9 planetary boundaries, which include things like the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and so on. What we do know is that the planet is an amazing self-regulating system, and it will regroup into some order that allows its processes to kind of find some kind of homeostasis. But that order will be highly destabilizing for us, very destabilizing. And destabilization, the most obvious ones we know about are extreme weather events, but we also know about the worry of currents shutting off, sea level rise, what happens when something is called a trophic cascade, which is when ecosystems lose the kind of vitality they need across prey-predation chains, and they just start to collapse, and whole areas start to go kind of temporarily dead-ish. Nothing's ever really dead on the planet, but it's dead-ish. So what's the problem for that? Well, it does a number of things. First of all, let me get down to the values here. It undermines 3 core human values. And trust me, I've been through all sorts of thought about social and global justice and anthropological difference and so on. I'm not trying to be reductive about human variability, but really there's widespread values across humanity. And here are 3 of them. Yes, there are in-groups and out-groups, but there are always complicated rules of hospitality, and there's a very core human value to have some kind of humanity for our fellow humans. And if your jaw stops on this because of all the wars and tribalisms and because of colonialism and its effects in this country, just think about what we've agreed on in the United Nations. We're supposed to have common humanity, and we agree to that at some level. Even more close to people is the thought that future generations are the kinds of we should be generous to future generations. Right? These are just assumptions. Their future generations matter. If you want an exercise to just reaffirm this, do what the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard called in Works of Love the duty to remember the dead. Just take some time and do that duty. Think about the people in your life who have mattered to you and who are no longer here, and really be with them. And you suddenly experience intergenerational being, and you understand that somebody you would hope is going to do that with you someday. All right, so that's a very core human value. And then the third one is that, despite what you might think when you look at how wanton our civilization can be with respect to the world of life, the widespread cultural appreciation of the world of life, right? Life is not something you just waste. You raise your kids to look at the beauty of the world, and kids immediately respond to the beauty of the world. When you take your time not to just be thoughtless about other animals and you spend some time with other animals, they're an amazing thing. As J.M. Coetzee said in The Lives of Animals, we're reading it today in Living Forms, they're filled with the fullness of life. And all we have to do is be sympathetic for a moment to realize that, right? So these are all human values, but because we're destabilizing the planetary system, we're undercutting all of these values. We're undercutting humanity for our fellow humans every time we put poor and vulnerable people at risk through, say, let's just take climate change as an example. right? We are undercutting our generosity and respect for future generations when we deliver to them a real huge mess that's going to be really hard to kind of sort the magic out of, right? When we deliver to them a hotter planet, a planet with sea level rise, with massive internal migrations, and so on. You've heard these litanies of woes, and they're very overwhelming, but I'm just bringing them back. And then, of course, insofar as we're even risking a mass extinction, we actually don't know if we're near a mass extinction, and so I disagree with the popular literature on this. I think it's not precise scientifically. The scary thing is we actually can't know because the kind of evidentiary record we need to know if we're in a mass extinction won't be possible for like 1,000 years. It has to sediment in the rock. But to even go near risking a mass extinction is mind-blowing. I don't even know how to wrap your head around it. I mean, there's been 6 of them since the beginning of life, or 5 of them. Ours might be the 6th. The last one was the extinction of the dinosaurs. We are at risk of producing that. So, it's really overwhelming. These are the moral costs of being in a civilization that is producing the Anthropocene. Okay, you with me? I know it's really like not great stuff, but it's the stuff we need. It's the stuff like, honestly, like ethical people, and we're really almost everybody's a decent person, right? Really, this is stuff like we have to slow down and like really like put deep inside ourselves somehow. So okay, so let me try to just give you the takeaway pretty quickly. Okay, so let me just give you one. I'll give you a short version of this, and this really like blows the minds of the students I work with, and it still blows my mind. We were just in seminar recently, like marveling over this. I want to just give you one. I'm going to make this really short so that we can. Well, I guess I do have about 15 more minutes before I can have some decent questions, but I want to try to make this as short as possible. So just think about, this point comes from a guy named Peter Singer who has kind of a modeled history as an ethicist, but it's a good point. So think about the way that we've evolved to think about responsibility, okay? So, I don't know. I walk over to you after this great and amazing song, and I just like take your guitar and I do a Jimi Hendrix on it from Monterey Pop, right? Right? And he's like, WTF, like you're a complete asshole, and sorry, I don't know if I'm not supposed to swear. Okay, good. And what do you, and of course he's hurt. I've hurt him by way of like destroying his beautiful musical instrument that makes all this beautiful music, right? So I'm clearly responsible for having done him a harm. Him, harm. Okay? But now let's look at this stuff, right? Let's look at the Anthropocene. Okay, it's all of us, okay, who are fortunate enough that we can be here today. It's, of course, yes, the people who the nasties who are kind of, maybe guilty of crimes against humanity, if not certainly really vicious people who are deliberately obfuscating the truth about climate change. It's those people too. But it's also people like my granddad, who was illiterate, was a coal miner, and worked at Thew Shovel in Lorraine, working hard. It's each of us when we had to work 3 shifts and at night, and we're beat. And all of us are part of the Anthropocene. What are we doing? We're part of just a civilization that is, say, based in fossil fuels, that is based in plastics, right? So we all contribute to the Anthropocene. Some of us, you could say, the people who literally create a false study and an obfuscating study in the media about climate change, those people, that's a very clear level of vice. It's falsification. But all of us are also responsible in some sense for the Anthropocene. And so were our ancestors, right? So how do you even think about moral responsibility in this situation? There's no, I did it, right? I smashed the guitar. It's like all of us. And if it's everybody, it's nobody, as a saying goes. Okay, so then there's another problem. Who is this hurting? Okay, maybe if we could link the behavior of people now with vulnerable people across the world, we could say that. But that's not the way that geological change works. That's not the way that ecological systems work, which are incredibly complex. They're nonlinear, right? So even they work over time. Insofar as people are being affected by climate change right now, say in Darfur, which is probably the clearest example of a climate-stressed civil war, right? The people who in some way created that, the civilization that created that, that's colonialism, that's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, those people are dead. So, I mean, we have no idea who we're affecting, especially when you think about future generations. We just know that we're going to be giving to future generations a destabilized planet. So there's no you. There's no me who did it. There's no you who getting hurt. And then let's talk about the broken guitar, right? The broken guitar. So what exactly is being harmed or hurt or broken? We don't really know. Not only don't we know because we don't know specifically how my carbon atoms can get up into the cycle of the atmosphere and maybe aggregate with all sorts of other carbon dioxide to maybe create some weather event somewhere in the future to maybe hurt someone who has to deal with something worse than Katrina. But we also don't know because ecological systems are nonlinear. They're so complex, we literally don't have a way of charting out the causality. So how do you think morally in a situation like that? I'll just leave that with you. That's the mind-blowing problem. And we're not equipped, as the primates that we are, we're not equipped to think like that. We're equipped to deal with small communities and hierarchies, unfortunately, which we try to subvert, and in-groups and out-groups, which we try to transcend, and that's how we do it. Clear? Okay. So now let me give you the takeaway point about anthroponomy. So anthroponomy is a really nasty, ugly word, but I can't think of a better word. You're probably more comfortable with the word autonomy, right? Hey, you've got some autonomy. All right, cool. Where can I put it? Just think of the same word. Nomos is the root of autonomy. It means something like custom, regulation. Sometimes it even meant ethics for the Greeks. Autos is self. So autonomy is like feeling like your life is accustomed to yourself, like you're able to kind of govern your own life, like it's an expression of your own purposes. That's autonomy. But we're dealing not with selves here. We're dealing with a collective so big that it's all of humankind right now. Okay? So what do you want to call that? Anthroponomy. Why do we have to think about humankind as a whole? Because as I just suggested, those little minuscule effects that we're all producing are the effects that only at the level of the planet as a whole add up to the kind of change we're talking about. I mean, this might surprise us, but if just Cleveland, I used to live in Dubai, right? Highly polluting city. Also, interestingly, a very green-thinking city, but that's another conversation. But like Dubai was incredibly wasteful, incredibly energy-intensive, more so than even New York, but which is in many ways a very efficient city, but that's another discussion. But in any case, Dubai could pollute as much as Dubai wanted. We could pollute as much as we wanted, and we wouldn't cause just our country even the Anthropocene anytime soon. So trust, we're the major polluters, one of the major polluters, but historically the major polluter. But in any case, it's a species level problem. So the problem is this: you've got an entire species that is not used to thinking about how the effects of its everyday actions, when you put them together, what we call aggregate them, how those effects undermine the very values that pretty much the species holds as its core values. And so the only thing to do in that situation is to take on the really impossible task right now of creating anthroponomy. A situation where we can say, in real conscience, for real, we can sing about it, we can feel it, we can know it in our souls, and we can rock and roll with it, that, yeah, you know what we're doing on this planet, it's in line with our core values. it's like a kind of species level integrity. But what we have now is this torsion that is undermining our core values. Is the idea of anthroponomy clear? Okay, I mean, how to do it, really complicated, right? Okay, so that's anthroponomy. So I'm just going to give you 4 takeaway points from this today and end with a bit about personal care for the self, keeping the kind of magic in the mess. I was really thinking about this, and so I really don't want this to be misunderstood when this goes away from here. So look, if anthroponomy is what we've got to do, on pain of contributing to a world that puts the future generations at risk, put fellow humans at risk, and undermines the world of life, if that's what we got to do, then for real, part of being a decent human being, like just a good person, has to be that in some level in our life, when we're able and aware, notice that condition, when we're able and aware, we have to be engaged with changing the institutions that produce this undermining of anthroponomy. In other words, we have to become political. Why? Because as you could tell, the level of problem is at the level of the structure of society. It's in our energy regime. It's in the way that we price things or cost things. It's in the way that we have our political systems, short term, not long term. And I could go on and on about this. But the only way to get an entire collective that's planet-wide to start coming in line with its own values is through institutional change. And that means that it's on every single one of us to be politically responsible to, I know we've got so many things in our lives, but some part of our lives, when we're aware and able, needs to be, I say, oriented toward that. So, I mean, having, this is another bad word, having an anthroponomic orientation, I know, it sounds great, right? I mean, it's good. You could put it on your social media profile. I'm like anthroponomically oriented. Probably get some interesting messages off of that. But in any case, right, so, but that, we have to have that in our lives in some place, or we're failing to be fully decent people. So I know that's a really strong claim, but I think it follows from the fact that we have obligations to future generations, obligations to our fellow humans, and that it's really, it's not cool to just waste life. That's not something that a responsible person does. So, that's the one that sounds a little moralizing, and I guess it is, and I believe in it, actually. But the key thing is I understand we're all really busy, and we have a really big life. The key thing is getting a part of our life oriented toward this task, because this is the thing our species is going to have to do for the next 200, 300 years. It's like building a cathedral. Okay? So then a couple other things. Part of being able to orient ourselves that way is that, when we have time and when we can make time, we need to learn to think like a planet. So how many of you have heard the phrase, think like a mountain? Some of you, I could see you're nodding your head. So it's a famous phrase from the environmentalist, the land ethicist, Aldo Leopold. It's a beautiful phrase. He saw it in the green fire of the wolf's eyes when the wolf was dying, that you have to think like a mountain. And I mean, that's beautiful. It meant think like an ecosystem. But now we have to think like a planet. And so we need to create institutions that help us do that. A lot of folks are here in the media. We need to actually create representations that help us do that. And I just want to point out one of them here briefly, because I do have links on this site. If you're interested in representations of thinking like a planet, you might want to check out Neil Brenner's planetary urbanization project at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It's really amazing. It became an art exhibit that shows the different ways that the planetary urbanization impacts the most extreme and remote places on the planet, from orbital space to deep sea trenches to the Mojave Desert. Okay, so we need to learn to think like a planet. Hold on here. What's going on? We need also, so that's kind of spatial and ecological. We need also to start figuring out ways to think on timescales that humans have never thought. So actually, Christina's show at Spaces is an interesting send-up of that, right? One of the places I like most, if you're ever in upstate New York, is the Museum of the Earth in Trumansburg, New York. It's right outside of Ithaca. Any of you ever been there? It's an amazing museum. It's one of my favorite museums around. It was set up by students of Stephen Jay Gould, and it is this amazing condensed experience of the entire history of life, which is, of course, a geohistory, because life and Earth are completely interwoven in the actual history of the planet. Life changes Earth, Earth changes life, they're completely interwoven. So we need to have more kinds of ways of thinking on timescales that we've never had before, okay? And then the last one, I think, this is a lot of fancy words, but I mean, let me just get the idea behind it, is that, I mean, we live in a society that the structure of its economy and the structure of its politics makes it hard to keep unified, to be one, right? It's very competitive, it's very atomizing, right? We get subdivided into specialized tasks. We fight each other for minute pieces of space on the road. That's probably the image of it. And I'm not going to make a Marxist-style commentary on this. That's not my point, although there are interesting things to say in that tradition. The point is simply that if we're going to keep thinking big, we have to find ways to be able to get outside of that mental and emotional and moral space that happens when we're constantly thrown back in to the mess, constantly thrown back into competition with each other, because the only way to satisfy our moral duties to the future and to each other is going to involve us being able to keep this big picture in mind. Okay, so those are my 4 takeaway points for dealing with initially starting to think about and being anthroponomic. You with me? We good? And I'll just end with this. Okay. So in another one of my classes recently, we were going back and looking at the PreSocratics. These are the first people to develop what we'd think of as a proto-scientific method, about 2,700 years ago. And there was a group of PreSocratics called the Eleatics. You may have heard of someone named Parmenides, or you may have heard of Zeno's paradoxes of motion, the tortoise and the hare, Achilles and the hare. These were people who started to exercise consciousness after they criticized the way that gods were always kind of represented like the people that they came from. This critique of what's called the anthropomorphism of God, the way gods are made like us, led people to start thinking more deeply and abstractly. And they started to realize that when you use your consciousness to abstract away from what is before us and think about what really is, that you start to come up with a notion that they called the one. And this notion became really important. Plato put it at the center of his philosophy, and I want to leave you just with a kind of interesting bookend to some of the practices that you can find today to get us in touch with the one. So about 1,000 years after that, a Roman philosopher named Plotinus, he wrote in Greek, but he practiced in Rome, had a school on the streets in Rome, developed a set of meditative practices to help people get above their self-aware self-consciousness to something he called the one. And Plotinus said there were 3 levels to the self. There is kind of everyday unconscious, kind of unself-consciousness while you're absorbed in stuff. Then there's like, you start reflecting on yourself and you become self-conscious. And that also usually involves like kind of egotism at some level. And then he said if you could train yourself, you can get above that, where you don't, I would describe it as a-consciousness, as in atheism or, right, without consciousness. And why is it without consciousness, not unconscious? Because consciousness always involves consciousness of something. There's always myself and the object. We're split. But when you engage in these practices, there is no self and other. There just is the one. And his experience of that was that it was deeply calming and nurturing and allowed him to see the beauty in everything around him. And this is interesting because you're used to this from meditative practices that have come out of, say, Buddhism or Taoism. But Actually, this was also found in the philosophical tradition. And so what I'd like to leave you with today is that I'm just sharing something that I do. Because I really, like I brought up my granddad. I think it's like, I don't know, there's something meaningful about talking about that in Cleveland. And, he used to get up. He's a Slovak, basically an immigrant. He used to get up every morning and, you'd hear him, open his hymnal, and he would sing at 5 a.m. before he'd usually go to the coal mines or then go to the work in a metal shop. But anyways, he would center himself. And I often think about my granddad because he had a lot of dignity. And what we need in this kind of crazy life we live in with such a huge task is we need to be able to think way beyond ourselves, way beyond our egos, and really think about what we're given to the future and how we're doing people right. And so for myself, it's really hard with all the stuff I got to do. So I need to find some practice in the day where I can come back to the oneness of all of us, which I actually really believe is true, is there. So I just leave this for you. When you're dealing with something as difficult as the Anthropocene, remember that there are very simple practices, from music to getting, loving the people around you, slowing down to really become human again. And then there are these kinds of meditative practices in many traditions that can allow you to keep your eye on the goal, which, as I said, should be anthroponomy. Thank you.